For those of you who just joined us, my name is Arnaud Wagener. I'm NTP Evaluation Lead at BF, and I'm chairing this session about platform trials. Our speaker is James Wason, Professor of Biostatistics at Newcastle University. James, I know that your colleague Michael Grayling is also in the room, and Michael is also ready to answer questions as well. Michael, thanks very much for being here, and welcome to you. So James will be speaking for 25 minutes. After that, we've got a few questions for the audience, and then we'll have 15 to 20 minutes for questions and answers. So James, over to you, and thanks again.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really nice to be able to talk a bit about an area I'm interested in, which is platform trials. And hopefully, I don't know much about education research, so hopefully with your expertise in the room, we'll be able to decide whether platform trials might be suitable for education research. And again, I'm sorry if you can hear drilling in the background. It just started a couple of minutes ago, which wasn't the best time. Anyway, so here's the overview of what I'll be talking about. So I'll be talking about evaluations of new interventions and how we do it traditionally, and about how we want to improve efficiency. And I propose that platform trials could be a good way of improving efficiency in evaluating interventions. I'll talk a bit about the three different components that make up a platform trial, and you don't necessarily need all three to get an advantage. So you might end up with one or two of them being useful and not the third one. We'll hopefully discuss that. I'll talk a bit about when they provide advantages and disadvantages. And finally, I don't think I've got the answer to this, but we'll hopefully come up with it together. How might platform trials benefit education research? So when you have a new intervention in education, I'm sure as in health, it's really important to gather high quality information on whether it is useful or not, whether it provides benefits. And the highest quality of evidence comes through prospective trials or evaluations, with the gold standard being a randomized trial. And that involves randomizing either participants or clusters to a control arm and to an experimental arm, then following up participants for certain pre-specified outcomes and doing an analysis at the end whether there's a significant difference or not between the two arms. And if there is, well, by the randomization, we know that this is due to the experimental arm compared to the control, rather than for other factors that might be present. Main problem with this is that they're really expensive to do, and doing a trial can cost several £1,000,000. So innovative designs are really of interest, and there's been a lot of work on statistical methods for improving the efficiency of trials, mostly focused on drug trials, but a lot of what we do is applicable in other settings and maybe education research. So innovative designs can help, hopefully, through either reducing the average cost of doing an evaluation, through avoiding doing underpowered evaluations, so avoiding wasting resources on studies that have no chance of finding a truly effective intervention. And what I'll be talking about, which is combining what might be traditionally separate trials together, each answering a separate research question, into a single master protocol or platform trial. So that's what we're going to concentrate on today, but I'm also very interested in these other areas. So what is a platform trial? Well, there's three main elements that I'm going to talk a bit more about. The first is that there's generally multiple experimental arms or interventions being compared against a shared control group. There's also an adaptive design, as it's called, which allows dropping of less promising arms as information is gathered during the study on participant outcomes. And there's also the opportunity to add in new arms as they become available. So let's have a look at what this looks like as a whole, and then we'll look at the three individual components. So this might be how a platform trial could evolve over time. So at the beginning, it starts as a 3-arm study, testing 2 experimental interventions versus a shared control group. And as time goes on, as we're recruiting participants, they're randomized equally between these. At some point, we might have a good amount of information on participants who have been randomized to arm 2, and maybe it's not very promising. So we can perhaps stop that arm early and continue only with the more promising arm. Then a bit later, perhaps we could have a new arm that we wish to evaluate and decide that it's a good idea to include it in this trial and start randomizing participants again between 3 different arms, but now a different one. And at some point, we might reach the pre-planned number of participants on the first arm and stop and conclude whether it's better than control. What I think is worth saying is that these trials could potentially go on forever, and I've tried to make that clear here. So we could continue adding in new interventions and always be doing a platform trial. And perhaps if certain arms are showing benefit, they could be incorporated into the control arm. That's actually happened in some platform trials. So it's kind of like a constantly evolving evaluation in terms of what's being tested, but it's done in a way that's very efficient, and it's very hopefully good for participants enrolled onto the study. So let's have a look at the 3 different components of the platform study. First one is the multiple experimental arms. And I think multi-arm trials, which this would be if we had neither of the other 2, I think we should be using these a lot more often than we are, because they provide a big advantage on their own. So if we have the same outcomes in the same area that we're looking at improving interventions in, if we have several different interventions that we could test, well, the traditional way would be to do a separate evaluation of each of those against the control. But if instead we can incorporate them into a single multi-arm trial, then this is going to be much more efficient, because we only need one control group that's used in each comparison instead of a control group in each separate trial. So hopefully this gives an idea that we need fewer patients, specifically fewer patients on the control, but also fewer patients across the multi-arm trial compared to the separate trials. And the more experimental interventions we have in one multi-arm trial, the more we save from this shared control group. So that's the main advantage, that we need a lower sample size from doing these multi-arm trials. I think in some settings, these types of trials are more popular with participants as well, because I don't think many participants enroll on a trial with the objective of getting the control group. So the higher the chance they have of getting an innovative intervention, perhaps the more attractive the trial is. But of course, this might be different for education research. Also, we have an advantage that comparing the different experimental interventions would be easier in a multi-arm trial where everything is the same, rather than doing separate trials and perhaps using meta-analysis to compare them. Now, the disadvantage is that doing a single multi-arm trial is generally going to be a bigger trial than doing one 2-arm trial. So it might mean that doing a multi-arm trial looks a bit more expensive, but it's a lot more efficient than doing several separate trials. So perhaps we're paying a bit extra to answer what would normally take 2 or more evaluations. I'm not going to go into this, but as a statistician, I am interested in multiple testing and error rates. And it does raise the controversy of whether a multi-arm trial needs to adjust for the fact that there's now multiple null hypotheses being tested in the same intervention. So I won't go into that, but it's a controversial issue. I can say more if people have questions on it. Also, I mean, this is perhaps more relevant for drug trials, but if different interventions are funded by different companies, they don't generally like the idea of them being compared to another company's product. So I don't know if this is true in education research, but that can certainly happen in drug trials. So that's the first one. The second element is an adaptive design. And this has been a big research interest for both myself and Michael. We've done quite a bit of work on adaptive designs. So what is an adaptive design? Well, it's a way of making changes. So it gives an opportunity to make changes to an ongoing trial as you're collecting information on the outcomes of participants, but doing so in a statistically robust way so that we know that, say, the type 1 error rate and the power are set to some level, and as opposed to just making unplanned changes in a traditional two-arm study, for example. So it might look like this: rather than designing, doing, and then analysing, we have a step in the middle where we look at the data that's being gathered and potentially make changes, but doing so in a way that controls the statistical characteristics. And the main advantage of adaptive designs is that they can result in shorter, more efficient, and better for participants enrolled on the trial. So let me give you an example of a multi-arm, multi-stage trial that's got these two components, the multiple experimental arms and the adaptive design. Hopefully this might illustrate the advantage. So this is a trial that we're running in Newcastle in orthostatic hypertension called CONFORM-OH. And we have 3 arms in the study. One is the control group, which is just standard of care. There's no placebo in this trial. The second is standard of care plus a new drug, or a drug that's commonly used. And the third arm is standard of care plus a different drug. So the primary outcome here is the same. So this illustrates if we're bringing these what might be different studies together, we need to have a common outcome. Maybe that's a bit of an issue, but we have a common outcome, which is a questionnaire on symptoms in orthostatic hypertension. That's gathered at 6 months after patients are recruited. But it takes a while to recruit the planned number of patients, which is 366. So it would take about 30 months to recruit them. So patients who are recruited early on in the study will have 6-month data available for use relatively early on in the study before we've completed the recruitment of patients. So this illustrates why an adaptive design might be useful in this case. We plan the interim analysis after we've randomized the 200th participant. Hopefully by that point, unless the recruitment rate is much faster than we imagine, we'll have got a good amount of information on about 150 participants, either the 3-month or 6-month outcome. And then we're going to use that to decide whether both of these experimental arms should continue, whether we maybe just continue one of them, or whether we stop the trial because neither of them are providing sufficient benefit. So we have quite a simple stopping rule in this case. We just look at the mean OHQ outcome at 6 months, and we stop any experimental arm in which that's worse than control. If both happen to be worse than control, we'll stop the trial. Otherwise, the trial continues to the 366 planned sample size. Although if only one arm continues, then that arm will get more patients than it would have got if we continue both. So this is a fairly simple stopping rule. It's not saying that we stop if the new treatment is significantly worse. It's just if it's doing qualitatively worse than the control group. So what's the advantage of an adaptive design? Well, in this case, it allows early stopping of ineffective interventions, which hopefully means that patients who are recruited have a lower risk of getting ineffective interventions as the trial evolves. Hopefully that would make it more popular with participants, maybe more so for participants that are recruited later on. And it also reduces the average sample size required by the trial. Although on the other hand, if the trial does continue to the end with all of the arms, then it does require a slightly higher sample size. So this average sample size comes from the opportunity to drop or stop the trial early. Another disadvantage is that we're including an extra analysis that we need to do. And in order for the adaptive design to be useful, this has to be really done quickly and also to a high standard. I remember the first trial I was involved with that used the adaptive design, which was quite a small study of imaging techniques. it wasn't my fault, but the interim analysis took about a year to do because it was gathering data, and therefore the adaptive design really didn't provide much advantage at all. But hopefully in this case, we'll be able to do the interim analysis much quicker than that, within, say, a month or maybe 2 months. Okay, so that's the adaptive design. So far we've got the multiple experimental arms and the adaptive design. The last piece of the platform trial is the opportunity to add in new arms. And an analogy I heard from Max Palmer, who is a big name in platform trials, is a statistician who's made a great contribution to making them acceptable for use in practice, is this idea of a steam train, a trial being like a steam train, where it's slow going at first as you're opening sites, but as you open more sites and you're getting things going, the recruitment rate goes up and you're reaching a maximum speed. And then at some point with a traditional trial, well, you've reached the target sample size, so you put the brakes on and close all of the trial and do the analysis. Well, a platform study where you're adding in new arms is using the momentum that you've built up in the trial to test new research questions. So once the pre-planned research questions you had on the first treatments you had, once they're answered, you can instead add in new research questions. And this has a lot of advantages. I think a really nice example of this is the STAMPEDE trial, which is, I think, probably the first example of a platform study that I'm aware of. So not only does this use adding in new arms, but it also has the multiple experimental arms and the adaptive design as well. And you can see it's been going for a long time. It started back in 2006, and it initially had 6 different arms, one of them being a standard of control. This is in prostate cancer. Each of the arms was testing adding in an experimental treatment, and you had the advantages of the multiple experimental arms with a shared control group that we talked about earlier. You also had interim analyses where less effective arms could be stopped early. So for example, this one and this one was stopped early due to lack of promise. And you can see that going from the beginning to the releasing the results, well, it took a long time. This is, years. And this would be the case with doing separate 2-arm studies as well. But as time went on and they're adding in new interventions, new research questions, you can see that the bar here is much smaller. This is the length of time it took to randomize the required number of participants. And much shorter. So the trial had been building up momentum, and these arms were answered much quicker than the existing ones were. So you can see over time they've added in new arms, and they've been answering research questions much quicker because they've got the infrastructure ready. And I think this approach has really been highlighted as very useful in the COVID pandemic as well, where the recovery trial used a very similar approach. But it didn't take us long to go from beginning to the first answered question, because a lot of these issues have been worked out before, and there was a lot of effort put in to set up the trial. It was put to the head of the queue. There was very little time needed for ethical approvals and such like. And also the recruitment rate was amazingly quick. So I'm not sure we'll be able to maintain the recovery trial, how well that did in other disease areas in the future or in education research. But STAMPEDE might be a better model of what's possible. So I wanted to give an idea of when platform trials might provide benefit. And these really come down to the separate elements that we've looked at before. So the first thing is that we have more than one intervention that we want to test. Maybe not all at once, all at the beginning, but eventually there will be a number of interventions to be tested. We also need good collaboration in the area such that a common master protocol can be agreed. We need a shared control group that everyone can agree on. We need overlapping outcomes used in each evaluation. To some extent, we need patients or participants to have the same inclusion-exclusion criteria for all arms, although you can deviate that from that slightly. You need a sufficiently high number of participants to be able to support these large randomized trials. If you have that, then you're going to gain from having a platform study because you're getting a lot of extra efficiency. You also need some commitment to ongoing funding. There's some underlying infrastructure required for a platform trial. And you also maybe will fund the trial to start with, but have new, for example, industrial partners funding new research arms that are added in later on. You also need buy-in from those who are going to be using the evidence generated. So in drugs, this is regulators. I don't know what it would be for education research, but you need the stakeholders who are going to use this evidence generated to agree that this is a robust approach to use. There's now a lot of information to show that it is. For the adaptive part specifically, and this is an area that Michael and I are particularly interested in, we have a PhD student who's working more on this. You really need that the outcome you're using to make the adaptations to be observed relatively quickly compared to the overall recruitment rate. As an example, if you had an outcome that took 3 or 4 years to observe and your recruitment period is 2 years, then by the time the first patient that you recruit has had information you can use, you've already recruited everyone and it's too late to make any changes with an adaptive design. We're looking for more like the Conform-OH example, where we had a 6-month outcome and a 30-month recruitment period. I wanted to finish with some further reading that, if you're interested in this area, you could look at. So this first one is hopefully an accessible overview of adaptive design. So it's not platform trials, it's the adaptive element of it. And adaptive designs are actually much broader than platform trials. So you might be interested in looking at that more generally. I think this is quite useful. It gives an overview of the more complexity there is in designing these types of trials. Again, it's focused on adaptive studies, but a lot of these are true for platform trials. So it's not something that you can get a statistician to design you an adaptive platform trial with a grant due next week. You really need to have a lot of time to develop. This is related to when adaptive designs might not be so useful. So the main message of this paper is about the endpoint length, but we also look at some other parts of when an adaptive design might not be useful. But still, you've got the shared control group and you've got the adding in arms from a platform trial, even if the adaptive design isn't so useful. Finally, a more recent paper on very statistically focused, I'm afraid, but it looks at the platform trials, issues that might arise from them. Some things that I didn't go into detail on that you might ask me about, like which control patients do you use to compare new arms that you add in, for example? How do you decide when to add a new arm in? How do you decide when to drop arms? This paper covers a lot about that, but there's still a lot of research to do. And the final thing I wanted to say before maybe we have some discussion is some challenges that I would guess are present for education research that might not have been considered so much in the platform trials literature, as they're mostly motivated by drug trials. First of all, I imagine a lot of education research is clustered, and I'm not aware of a cluster randomized platform trial. Maybe someone here will set up the first one. But there is an example of a cluster randomized multi-arm, multi-stage, so with the shared control group and the adaptive element. It's not an education research study, but it is an example of a cluster randomized multi-arm, multi-stage. Michael's really the expert in cluster randomized trials and using adaptive approaches, so it's good that he's here. He can answer questions if they come up on that. Long-term outcomes, this is something I'm not sure about, but again, this is more focused on the adaptive element. So maybe education research has got very long-term outcomes that mean an adaptive approach might not be suitable, but the upper elements may still be useful. And even if you've got a long-term primary outcome, you could still benefit from an adaptive approach if you've got a good shorter-term outcome that you can use to make the adaptations. I'm sure there's many other challenges, and hopefully we might discuss some of them now. But if you're interested in more information about our group, we do a lot of work in innovative trial designs, then we have this website, and both myself and Michael would be happy to get emails on this. So I think I'll leave it on that slide and hopefully open for questions.
Thank you so much, James, for this very interesting presentation, which I found very clear and really thought-provoking. And also, thank you very much for sticking to the time